The idea behind this discussion series was that the installation had quite a bit to do with work in new media, and that there were people that worked in that media with incredible seriousness and acuity, and that if we could lure them here to show some of their work and talk about it, that it would be good for everyone at SCI-Arc to get a look at it. And frankly, on a more personal level, it's been actually kind of a thrilling experience just to be able to collaborate a little bit with some friends who work very differently than we do, but I hope, and I believe in Ante's case, really taken wonderful advantage of the circumstance. And I should introduce, this is Ante Liu. I would go with conceptual artist from Toronto, Canada, although I have a feeling the designation will be a little limited. Ante has a piece that jumps to mind that I think in this context is really important to see is his installation at last year's Venice Biennale, a piece that really sort of introduced the entire Biennale suspended. It's almost a city. Correct title is the Cloud. But Ante has been working in a variety of media, and actually, as he was telling me, rarely, but with some new and video. And I
work in old media.
And actually, to a certain degree, architecture as media, which I will touch on tonight. And Bettina Korek is the founder of For Your Art. I imagine Bettina is familiar to quite a few of you. Bettina writes an incredible blog on the contemporary art world. And in this case, I have to say, though there are 3 more of these Friends of Friends nights, and in most of those cases, it really was one friend that pulled another into my frame of reference. In this case, I'm happy to say these are both friends of mine who met this afternoon. So they are friend and friends now.
We're friends now.
Yeah, friend expert. And with that, thank you. Thank
you, John. This is really, it's so amazing to see this realized, and we're both really excited to be here to support you. But maybe we can kind of begin at the beginning, which I know is at SCI-Arc when you and Joe met. And your first kind of collaboration evolved right after that, or was it during your thesis project?
I think Joe you did your thesis a little earlier than the rest of our cohort.
I did. You and I both had very elaborate thesis projects, but they were offset by almost a year.
Yeah. I mean, I was telling Bettina earlier that I was glad that Joe, in his conversation with Eric Moss, mentioned that part of this somehow related to a project that he had done in second year at SCI-Arc in a studio taught by Robert Mangurian, where you did a Panopticon cinema, is that right? So, and that somehow this project here is related to interests that you had developed, way back then. And I was telling Bettina that, we both had kind of like seriously over-dense thesis projects, and that we had an affinity for each other's theses at that time, because we're probably the only 2 people that understood each other's theses. And in my case, I can't say that this is a part of my thesis project or emanates from a project that I did in school, except for the disco ball, which is in this scene right now, because there was a disco ball in my thesis project, and I've always wanted to have a real one since then. This was a great excuse, even though there's no disco ball in Blow Up.
And so we have Joe's kind of obsession with the Matta family is manifested in all of this, and then the film Blow Up was also kind of influential for what you did.
Yeah. How did you choose Blow Up?
I was telling Bettina I'm much clearer on Blow Out. I was teaching Matta-Clark that week, and but Antonioni's films in general were on my mind, and I think partly I was looking for double.
Well, because this is the tennis, is that a reference to Antonioni?
Yes.
Okay.
this is the last scene in Blow Up after everything else has transpired. And the protagonist, played by David Hemming, goes back to the park where he thinks that he has witnessed and photographed the murder. And then this group of students, or I don't know what they are, anarchist students, models, shows up, and they were in the very beginning of the movie, and they show up at the end, and there is a mimed tennis game played, an imaginary tennis game with an invisible ball, and then he's watching, and then at one point the imaginary ball goes over the fence, and they ask him to go fetch it for them, and so he walks and picks up the imaginary ball and throws it back into the court. So I kind of interpreted it wrong, actually, because there's a real ball here.
But the cat wasn't that interested in the real ball.
Well, more interested than she would have been in an imaginary ball. I mean, it's incorrectly transcribed here because I was working by memory. I hadn't seen the movie in 15 years, and I decided not to view it again before I started shooting. But whereas in the Blow Up, there's an imaginary ball, and he throws the imaginary ball back. Here, there is a ball that somehow traverses space and time from the 1980 Wimbledon final between Borg and McEnroe and shows up in our time next to Pookie. So there's a disconnect there as well.
And the model that Pookie is going through, you were saying, is held up by that kind of stack of books. And this project really, one of the main ideas is the kind of blend, the architect working in what is kind of considered an art space, and that kind of the ambiguity that comes out of that, and just in your practice is so closely tied to that. You started out at SCI-Arc and you went to teach, and then at that point though, while you're still teaching, you started to kind of work in the art context.
Yeah. What should I say?
I know, I think it's a personal connection.
I throw this connection out there, that my fascination with the Matta family was over precisely this phenomenon, that both Gordon Matta-Clark and his father, Roberto Matta, had studied architecture and lapsed, I might not be good, had risen to careers in fine art. And that shift, and I think Ante is as apt a character to consider the kinds of decisions one needs to make and the kinds of actually long-term planning one needs to enact in order to make that transition really plausible. I think it's still an interesting and kind of open question.
Yeah. So we're going back.
Yeah.
I mean, I was telling Bettina earlier that, I started teaching about the same time that I semi-self-consciously gave up architectural practice in order to do work that I would say in retrospect allowed me to behave for a longer time more like a student. So, and that's what I still do now.
But you're sending students.
It's more loaded than that, but that would be a short.
Pretty loaded.
What's that?
It's pretty loaded.
It is.
Artists are architecture students.
What's that?
Artists are architecture students.
Well, no,
Or
that's
like
not what I'm
architecture.
saying. But what one does in school is perhaps not any school. I think it's not necessarily what you do after.
Do you think, was there something in particular to your experience at SCI-Arc that kind of led to this, do you think?
Well, I think so. I mean, a lot of the people that Joe and I collaborated with on leaving SCI-Arc are in this room right now. So, I mean, SCI-Arc was, and still is an experimental school, quote unquote. And it is, I hope, still interested in theory, and I think I said it also at least in our day, fetishizes the artifact, you know, or the artifacts that come with architectural inquiries. So I think that, I mean, and also at the time that we studied, I mean, theory was quite important to us. We didn't think we had any jobs, you know, coming to us because there was nothing being built, and we didn't look for them. And we read a lot and made funny things, hopefully well and in unusual ways. And so, yeah, I mean, SCI-Arc was of course a hugely formative experience, and I wouldn't be doing what I'm doing if I hadn't studied here.
Over the past, I guess, 9 or 10 years, one of the things that you've worked a lot with is this air purifier. And I know that you had your first kind of experience with this in college.
Yes.
And you kept it with you. Can you talk about when you first had the idea of using it in a different way? What was that?
I mean, I was asked to do my first solo exhibition when I was living in Vancouver, and that's where I moved after being here. And I was thrift shopping a lot, and I noticed a lot of disused air purifiers in thrift stores. And I kind of wondered why there were so many, and I kind of realized that people really like to collect these things or use them because they're good for you. And but at the same time, then they got rid of them. And I was just wondering why that was. And then I remembered, and then I found one that I actually had 10 years earlier when I was in undergrad. It was kind of like this amazing thing because we just sit there and breathe in purified air all day long. I think it was really great for us, and believe in what was good about that. So, but in the time that had elapsed since I had gone to architecture school, and I started to recognize these purifiers as having an affinity with a lot of sort of early modernist architectural forms, and then that reminded me in turn of the role of the rhetoric of hygiene in early modernism and the way that informed both a kind of sort of scientific understanding of how the relationship between hygiene and design might be good for you, but it also kind of, I think, slightly mischievously informed an aesthetic of purity as well, which was already a kind of an ambition, say, an aesthetic ambition in early modern architecture. So scientific hygiene and visual hygiene, I think, got conflated in an interesting way. And then sort of fast forwarding to our own more current obsessions with hygiene, I thought that sort of provided some an interesting starting point to do in our project.
And last year when you did Cloud at the Biennale, you kind of had a breakthrough hanging them from the ceiling. And did that kind of, because there was always this kind of utopian reading of these installations. And was that, do you think that it'll kind of still work in that direction? Maybe. I would like to, because I mean, hanging, I don't know if you've seen pictures of that, but I mean, it's that hanging these machines, bringing them together. I mean, I always want, and it's happening here as well. I realized that when I first started doing this, I thought, well, this has nothing to do with anything else I've done, because I've never done a cat video before. But then I kind of realized that I am often playing with scale, and what I do normally is a kind of rereading or a translation of something where the scale often changes, or that things operate at multiple scales, right? And so in the instance of Cloud in Venice, bringing those machines together and suspending them created a set of possible readings that alluded to, yet again, another model of an architectural proposition, a group of machines read at 1-to-1 scale and operating, certain fantastic visionary cities and science fiction images. So it kind of had that, it worked in that it was able to conjure a lot of different images at different scales and throughout different moments in the
history of the 20th century.
And Corbusier's Radiant City often comes up in kind of dialogue about your work. And you said something really interesting about that earlier, that was he kind of seeing how far he could go with these ideas, like was it meant to be taken seriously?
I think it was, but I mean, I think there was a certain kind of self-conscious transgression, you know, going on there. I mean, I think part of it was meant to provoke and to be enacted, but, you know, either or both, and I think it worked.
And does like the sense of, you were saying, when all of these purifiers are installed, in one of them they were redoing, like how much, it was every hour they purified the whole room?
Every 30 seconds.
Every 30 seconds. And was that something that people could really sense?
Yeah. In that instance, yeah, this was the exhibition at SCI-Arc Gallery, and they were really powerful, and it was probably changing the air in a pretty dramatic way. The whole room seemed alien because it was so clean, really. So it was a kind of, you know, this slightly demented over-functioning of these things, like the logic and the ambition of these things played out to an extreme.
When did you first kind of become interested in Levittown?
When did I first? Right at the beginning when I started doing this genre of work. Quite by accident. I just found a picture of Levittown and I scanned it and I started multiplying it, like a Rorschach's test, to form a larger pattern. It was already a pattern, and then it got multiplied and multiplied and multiplied. And then it became even stranger and stranger, but it kind of sort of kept the original qualities.
And that was kind of then produced as wallpaper? Was that one of your first works that you felt was an art project?
I didn't know what it was at the time, but yeah, it was one of the first of whatever it was.
I mean, do you think we were talking about, Richard Armstrong, who's director of the Guggenheim Museum, was recently asked about the end of the avant-garde and the end of this idea of the inaccessible in art, and if we had gotten to that point, and he said yes, and you disagreed with that. You were saying that, you know, people are still, like we were talking about Rob Pruitt's art.
Whether we can still make something that's inaccessible or no? Yeah, and I thought that we could, or at least new. I mean, this place wouldn't exist if people didn't think that something new could be made still, I think.
But as we kind of address this issue of, is something, you know, is it art, is it architecture, is it architecture in an art space? Do you think that that has to be a kind of self-conscious decision?
That's a question that I try to avoid. Yet I can't.
Why?
Is it art or is it architecture? Because I think it has a lot to do with who's making it and with what intention. And I'm personally not so interested in the question, to tell you the truth. I mean, for me, you know, and it's not because I think it's like in the eye of the beholder, but I think, I personally think it's quite clear, you know, what is art and what is architecture.
But there is a way that architects often,
notwithstanding all of the debates about is architecture and art and blah, 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 so.
there is something interesting about the way that architects often speak about, I mean, coming from the art context, it's sometimes intimidating the way that architects talk about their own work, and whether or not artists have that same tendency. There is.
Well, we touched upon this earlier. Why is it intimidating?
Well, it becomes very like theory driven.
Yeah.
Quickly. I mean, even Joe talking about your conversation on Friday, like, does it become?
It was intimidating to me.
Yeah.
I wonder a little bit as I was listening to the two of you, and maybe Ante, this might be a little bit of a way past the impasse, but I think Ante and our friendship is framed in this small part on kind of wondering about utopia, wondering about the possibility of utopia, and I actually think that impulse spans some disciplines. I said Friday actually, and I think Ante and I agree wholeheartedly on this, though it casts us in very different roles. I think I'm think we're both pretty rigorously Duchampian in the sense that we view the art and architecture question in terms of, in terms of who the author is and what the environment is. The Duchamp names a work art, and by virtue of this being an artist and putting it in a museum, so creates it. I actually think the same is more or less true of my work. I am an architect. This is an architecture school, and this is certainly. I don't think there's any. In fact, part of why I'm hoping this conversation plays out, and these conversations play out recently, is that I hope I know my role, I'm comfortable in it. I think. But Ante and I reached a similar familiarity with Duchamp, and actually I was going to bring up Gerhard Richter, whose notion of the utopian I think was a much more loaded one for Ante and I as we were trying to kind of shape our futures in the mid-90s. His notion of how art production or a certain way of working in the world could take on a kind of utopian scale was important. And I think it relates to how, maybe, I guess this is my question on today, to the degree that the air purifier work and even Levittown alludes to a certain kind of serial utopia of affordable housing in America, but the lion's share of your work, I think, actually alludes to a more Corbusian notion of an early 20th century utopian possibility that arguably has been realized at the level of an appliance while not at the level of a city. I wonder if, and as I think I'm sorry to keep coming back to the Mattas, but Matta-Clark became an artist by working for Corbusier and meeting Dalí and André Breton renouncing Corbusier. And it was that disavowal of his previous discipline that was central to his formation as an artist. And similarly, Matta-Clark's blowout was, as he himself described it, an act of transgression against a bunch of teachers, the New York Five that he had at Cornell. That kind of high white modern strain seems like an important frame of reference to all three practices. Would you agree?
I don't know the Mattas as well as you do, so it's a little bit hard for me to answer that question.
But I suppose, I guess my point on today is that one of the tricky aspects of the question Bettina's framing for you is that it's not as though you left architecture wholesale and absolutely. You actually, much of your work, I would argue almost all of it, is refactoring your experience and expertise and assessment of that previous discipline in your new work.
And I don't think when I started, I thought about, leaving one discipline and embracing another, or renouncing anything. Like I think that, especially with our shared experience together after school, that we were, I could quote Popeye. It's like, I am what I am. Like we were doing what we naturally felt inclined to do. We were exercising ourselves and our skills and our sensibilities. Our interest in some kind of critical and jovial inquiry in certain ways, and part of that was through our formation here. We did kind of transgressive, critical, fun, interesting, useless work while we were together in school and years after. And I think it's in all of us to do this work. We've done it before. I just didn't grow up. I guess in some ways. That's a weird way of saying it, but there is a spirit of inquiry there that is not, it's not that rare, and it's not distinct to any discipline necessarily.
I guess maybe
Is that a bad one?
Yeah, no, I want to get away from. I think the point of the artist as architecture student is only marginally. I feel like it's a ploy. So I'm gonna maybe I'd ask the question in a different direction about velocity. I actually think a lot of your shifts had to do with being able to move in certain directions more quickly without getting mired in certain aspects of, it's true that I should say Antonioni and I were both involved in a collective, Hedge Design Collective, of which many members are here. But I think the sense that sense of play and its possibilities has stayed an incredibly important and animating aspect in your work, but I think it was also honestly the case that it slipped away in many people's.
And and I don't know if Auntie just did an amazing public art project in Toronto that's kind of really captured the imagination of the city, and play, I think, is part of the reason it's been so accessible. Can you talk a little bit about that project?
Yeah, I think maybe some in this room have seen pictures of it, but I was asked to propose a project for something called the Leona Drive project. Leona Drive is a little street, a cul-de-sac, in one of the oldest post-war suburbs in Toronto. These houses were built in 1948. They resemble quite a lot the Levittown houses, and a developer had purchased 6 of them in a row that they wanted to knock down because nobody kind of really wants to live in these things. Well, no, they do, but it would be more profitable to knock them down and build higher density townhomes on these in a more contemporary style. And these curators contacted me to ask me if I could propose a project to transform one of the houses for a temporary installation that would last only a week and a half. And they asked me, I said, this sounds great. And I kind of thought already, I imagined what these houses would look like, but I didn't see it yet. And I thought, well, 3 options played through my mind, and I thought, I bet one of them looks exactly like Monopoly House. And then I saw the picture that they sent me of my house, and it did look like a Monopoly House perfectly. But, and so I proposed this, and I transformed it into a life-size Monopoly House by gradually stripping it down to its bones and then having it painted over and over again until it became a kind of bright plasticky green color scale. So yeah, there is a sense of play in that. There's a sense of scale. That's taking a house that's this big, that's iconic, and conflating it with something that's life-size, but is equally iconic, but it had become kind of harder to read over the years as everything was added to it and bushes grew around it and you couldn't see the form as well. And just spending a couple of months sort of working on this thing until it got back to its sort of platonic Monopoly House.
What were the castings? You did do castings of the house as well?
No. Oh, I did a parallel project at the same time because I was asked to do a related project for the Toronto International Art Fair to help promote the Leona Drive project, which was affiliated. So I made a replica of that same house about this big. I forget what scale it was. So that house was, life-size, and I turned that into something that resembled something quite small, toy-like. And then for the casting, I did a replica of that house made out of caulk. It was solid household caulking. So, different, but...
And were you thinking about, we just came out of this huge crisis and the idea of all of our debt, and it becomes repackaged and farther away from the real thing. Did you think about any of those issues and how this one house kind of represents all of that?
At first I thought about just the idea of real estate when I was doing this because, obviously, a developer, this thing had a certain kind of value, a certain kind of aspiration, desirability associated with it when it was first built. That has changed a lot. The developer wants to knock all these things down and turn it into something else. And, it just reminded me that nothing's permanent, really. Nobody develops anything unless they think they're going to make a lot of money, right? It's really not worth it. And, but it was, when I was asked to do this project, it was maybe this March or April, but we really were at the height of the subprime mortgage crisis. And I think that at that time because there's so many news stories about it, a lot of people, including myself, were becoming so aware of how abstract the debt on one's property can be, right? That these things, your debt on your house can be repackaged into all kinds of, bizarre investment vehicles, part of which is lumped in with someone's pension fund in an Eastern European country, whatever, right? So that definitely factored into it, for sure. But I also just like thinking about Monopoly. I mean, Monopoly is like a really fun, vicious game, right? It's like you roll the dice, you try to accumulate property, you try to add value to your property, and you try to get rich by other people landing on your property and you extracting money from them until they all go broke and you're the only one left.
Scary. We were also thinking about, you and Joe have this kind of shared practice of parallel thinking, connecting things that don't really necessarily feel connected. And I was just also thinking about, this has been, your trajectory has been really organic. Like, it doesn't sound like you plotted this kind of line for yourself. And then Joe makes these amazing diagrams, these complex maps of how things relate to each other and scripting. Is that something that you do as well, like looking at patterns of information and trying to kind of...
Yeah, I would say that Joe is a formidable diagrammer and nomenclator, and as Eric pointed out the other day, very interested in linguistics or words. And I was curious, blow by blow. It's a great namer of things, right? It's an amazing title, and to pair Antonioni up with Gordon Matta-Clark, two people that I've been interested in as well. But to do it in that way, but then for me to kind of also sort of trust that there was some kind of natural connection between these two figures, but that also that you wanted a doubling, right? And
yeah, all I would say is that my diagramming is certainly inspired in part by some of Monte's work. In particular, a kind of strain in his work that has to do with fields of play. And I was thrilled to watch Pookie this morning for the first time, but the break to Wimbledon floored me. And it was partly that these, Ante and our friendship has partly revolved around racket sports, which we tried to, pretty scary way to reinvestigate yesterday. Ante is a beautiful piece that we've managed to get our hands on that involves a stack of squash courts. And they're squash courts rendered in crystalline volume so that only the lines of play are really, really legible in a certain, in a certain respect. And that patterning, I think actually the degree to which patterns achieve a certain kind of plausibility in their own right. When I'm diagramming, things have to kind of reach a certain point of density, actually, before they really hold the page or my interest, honestly. And in a way that I think that graphics aren't a minor part of it. Ante's got a boat pay.
Well, you were telling me about a project for, was it Berlin, where you mapped the city through its waterways?
No, it was a public art project for, basically the DWP of Dusseldorf. And I did a project where it's a map of Germany, but it's only the water in Germany. And so I proposed a large mural for that project, which is it's all the waterways of Germany, and then Germany looks a certain way, but then it's doubled as well. It's basically flipped like a butterfly pork chop, symmetrically, and so it ends up looking like a pair of lungs or a butterfly or something else, or a Rorschach's test, which is also happening in the Levittown part. But I should say, in this case, Joe's linguistic doubling of blow, in blow by blow, mean, I think accident always has a lot to do with everything and some shared interests. And so there's Matta-Clark and then there's Antonioni. And it turned out that, I mean, I first proposed a cat video just because I was nervous about the fact that I really have not made a video before. And so that was the only thing I could think of. And then Joe said, great. But then, in thinking about Antonioni, and it turns out that Blow Up was one of my favorite films about a long, long time ago, and I hadn't seen it in ages. I used to have the soundtrack for it, and I kind of like realized that, you know, watching it again recently, that it probably made a huge, huge impression on me.
I think we had a shared and complete misremembrance of the film in different respects. My allusion to it actually turned out to be almost mistaken.
I'd forgotten a lot of things that happened in it. But, I mean, the fact that he chose that, you know, partially to get a linguistic doubling, made me sort of, in turn, think about, well, what am I going to do with a cat video, right? Like, you know, like, I mean, his thing is so loaded, and I just said I'm going to make a cat video, and then I thought, okay, well, maybe the cat should have a place to live in or to hang out in. And so that's when I got the idea to ask Joe for the drawings for this installation so that I could blow down his thing while at the same time blowing up my cat, so that there's a whole different, you know, scale operation happening. And then at the same time, and then I was like, okay, well, there's a blow up, blow down. But then I was also compelled to. So I had to figure out how to make his model, or the model of this installation, which was really difficult. But then I thought, well, what's the narrative, what's the dramatic arc going to be in this? And so naturally, it was to try to create some seminal scenes from Blow Up, which is what's happening here, actually. So it's like there's 5 scenes from Blow Up that I attempted to recreate by memory. From having seen the film a lot when I was younger, and then with the added difficulty of trying to direct my cat, which is hard. So it's a series. It's a chain of instigations and challenges that I found quite pleasurable to take on.
I always thought about that it was also had to do with the kind of dissatisfaction with the photographic medium blowout.
Mm-hmm.
The film. Do you know what I mean? Like, do you feel any kind of I know you made this question, but have you was there a dissatisfaction with the, you didn't want to build, you said before, you don't want to build, you don't have that kind of.
To build buildings?
Yeah.
I would if somebody asked me to.
Okay.
It's not that I don't want to,
Okay.
It's just, but it's also, it takes expertise that I don't necessarily have, and clients that I don't have.
Well, and Joe brought up the idea of architecture as media.
Yeah, well, it's funny, I said architecture as a medium and a play, but to make it plural actually probably opens it up in more interesting ways. This was something, and again, something that a lot of people in the room were involved with in the 90s. A lot of architects were looking at contemporary art and seeing a lot of work, actually over a 20 or 30 year period, where architecture was deployed in novel ways by artists, essentially as the medium of their work. And I think a lot of architects were trying to make sense of that back into our field in one way or another. But I think architecture as media, for me, raises actually the more specific question of the media. In some ways, a lot of the kind of presumptions of this installation are actually primitive in terms of how media functions today. The fact that we're working with projectors and dedicated DVD players, not trying to kind of broadcast this globally through 101 modes, Bettina, that you're really incredibly adept with in terms of kind of contemporary communication. I think architects, I won't speak for architects, I'll speak for myself, I think I have actually kind of an anachronistic fixation on the early possibilities of new media, and in particular just the spatial properties of projection in gallery space, and how that, I like being in that environment, the kind of specific early erratics of new media work are something I really want to somehow find, invite into my work. And this way, it finds its way here.
Any questions?
Yes, I have one. You mentioned architect as media. How about architect as entertainment?
As what?
Entertainment.
I can't answer that question, but I think that's directed to you.
Do you mean kind of architecture as spectacle, and the validity of architecture as kind of as sort of a consumable, a kind of mass consumable experience?
I look at entertainment almost as 3D media. And so I kind of look at entertainment as perhaps three-dimensional and media. Media as three-dimensional and entertainment as four-dimensional.
And turn how it's kind of temporal. I agree with you. Actually, I think it's sort of an odd tack to take with your question, but it raises for me something that was really central in the development of the works on the walls and of the project that relates to corrections and collections. I've been looking at prisons and museums in particular for the last decade, and I've been really interested in how how there's been a kind of twin building boom in both. They play an oddly paired role in urban renewal in American cities. But one of the things that was most interesting to me as I got back into that work a couple of years ago was this shift from what I began to see as a minimal and post-minimal way of dealing with the presence of the object in the gallery or in the city to this focus on immersive, thoroughgoing environments. And I think this relates a little bit to what you're talking about. I do think, frankly, that all of that cultural production in general, art, architecture, and otherwise, mass entertainment, entertainment period, at this point is about the fabrication of experiences and about these kind of immersive environments, whether they're actual simply spaces of immersion that take the notion of kind of projection, of the aura of projection in 1,000 new and really unpredictable ways, or whether it's a question of a kind of temporal immersion, which interested me in terms of new art and actually. And one of the startling things when you look at contemporary incarceration, it was on the radio today driving around, if you listen to NPR, they're talking about LWOP inmates, which are, and the Supreme Court just assessed a case in which a 13-year-old was sentenced for a non-homicidal crime to life without parole. And the Supreme Court is trying to decide whether an adolescent should be, I would say, prey to that kind of draconian punishment. But I actually think this idea of, I think we as a society, and I do think it has a kind of odd millennial turn to it, I think we've become preoccupied with the idea of losing ourselves in a larger, more kind of affective field of experience rather than trying to come to terms with specific the specific properties of things in space. And I kind of say that I feel like there's a little bit of an edge or judgment to that, but I actually simply think that's the predicament we find ourselves in.
One more quickie.
Sorry.
When I look at this, I get an urban feeling.
I'm sorry.
When I look at this, I get an urban
feeling?
Yes. And when I hear you talk about prison and museum, I think about the sociological implications. When you deal with prison, you're dealing with power. When you're dealing with museums, you're dealing with
I think so. I think somehow.
I would say some form of sophistication, some form of power that is not as expressive as society as a whole, because we are distant from the museum, even though you brought it up. You had the power of tattoo, you had the power of race, with power of murder, the power of power. And when you use perhaps the method instead of the content, or content weak and the method strong, are you really getting to the prison?
I wonder, that idea of content weak and method strong, or method strong, content weak, I'd be tempted to assess the different things going on in this room, maybe along, I'm not sure what is headed in which direction. I would say this, though, basically about, with prisons and museums, I think one simple way of looking at the pairing is in terms of theaters of freedom and constraint. I actually think when you get into the internal dynamics of the two buildings, museums, especially museums of contemporary art, are, I think, fundamentally, before you get into relations of power, which are a major dynamic in museums as well as prisons, I think museums of contemporary art are about staging new investigations of freedom, new possibilities for how people can operate in space and redefine space. And actually, I think Ante is kind of, I mean this positively, but emblematic of that project in, maybe that kind of broad stroke definition of contemporary art. And prisons are, I think, equally obvious, they're even more obviously theaters of constraint. Theaters I use because, especially in the last 20 or 30 years, prison architecture is about the staging of discipline. New prisons, and we are able to build as many as we do and incarcerate as many as we do because we've developed these microcosmic theaters of constraint in which smaller numbers can be held within much larger groups after the pattern of Jeremy Bentham's Panopticon. And the degree to which the behavior of some is staged for an even more distinct few, I think these issues of sighting and of allowing certain kinds and orders of vision to some people and not others is actually kind of a defining feature of our time.
I think that chaos, complexity, probability, spirituality has allowed us to free ourselves and to look at art in a different way. And I think the jumping universe is like a takeoff on that, but then take it far enough. But I think we have the background and tools to investigate, to take our art to another level, and we take seriously contemporary physics and logic and language to an ultimate level.
I'm wondering if I can turn that to a question that will, and actually this does, I feel like your question touches on Olafur Eliasson. I'm going to go back in your direction on Ante and Bettina, because actually he's a figure that was very, very interesting for he was a kind of touchstone for our studio and imagining how this could come together. But I think he's also another figure who, while not kind of complicated by a past in architecture, ends up creating work that hovers between or deploys a lot of techniques of spatial definition. And I'm wondering if maybe, I also think, in terms of this question of the possibility of metaphysical or other kind of broader engagement with contemporary physics, it seems like where that conversation can start, and maybe where ours could evolve.
I think one of the reasons that Olafur Eliasson's work is quite closely studied by architecture students is because he really does deal with affect. He creates his work produces affect and rumination at the same time. But it pushes it to an extreme because it only is that, right? It doesn't have to do anything else except call your attention or immerse you in some kind of experience. So that gets back to the first question that was started.
Thank you, my friends.